Welcome to the Business Model Sandbox, where leaders of all kinds come to reinvent and transform their business models. Not just small incremental changes to the way things work today, but entire new ways to transform the way we create, deliver, and capture value. I'm Saul Kaplan. I'm the founder and chief catalyst here at BIF. I'm your host in the Business Model Sandbox, and each month I get the privilege of talking with a leading thinker and doer in the transformation space. And this is our first podcast of the new decade, so we're going to start off with a real bang. Today in the Business Model Sandbox, I welcome my friend Jeff Leitner. Jeff is, when I think about social innovation and someone who I think of as a social innovator, I think of Jeff, and I'm fortunate to have a lot of people who claim to be social innovators, but Jeff has been on the ground floor of this. He's an author, a researcher, a thought leader. He wrote the book See, Think, Solve. He's a fellow at New America. He's the founder of UX for Good, and he's the founder of Unwritten Labs, which, for heaven's sakes, is often called the first philanthropic think tank. For someone like me who came to the social sphere late in the game, I wish I had known my friend Jeff back in the beginning when I became an accidental bureaucrat, and started thinking about the public and social sector. I might have been a contender if I had known him then, but we're making up for lost time. I've known him for a couple of years. He's fantastic. Welcome to the Business Model Sandbox, Jeff.
Thank you, Saul. It's lovely to be here. I'd like very much to know the guy you just introduced.
Is it a comfortable introduction for you? Do you think about like all those years and those roles where you were paving the way in the way we think about social innovation?
No, I think about the fact that I've left dry cleaning at the cleaners for months at a time and forgotten to pick it up.
You don't think about stuff like that, do you? And you're uncomfortable. You're too humble, my friend, about the role that you played.
The sense that all of us have that social media is only part of the picture, that people post the best parts of their lives and we don't see the rest. That introductions, I think, are the same thing. I think you could do an introduction that is twice as long that has all the stupid things I've done in the past 20 years.
Yeah, so reflect on them for just a minute for me. Forget whether whether the claim of you being there at the beginning and making a big difference, which I know is true. How do you reflect on it? Where are we around this whole conversation about social innovation, changing our social systems, to make things better, for those of us that live within them, whether as a citizen, as a patient in healthcare, as a student in education. Do you think we've made progress?
Yes and no. Here's what I mean. I think objectively, if we could get the intellectual distance, we could see, looking at the last 20 plus years, that we have more responsive, more democratic systems in place than we used to have. I think in the same way that the entrepreneurial sort of explosion, more and more people starting their own companies, has diversified the commercial marketplace, I think we've seen the same sort of democratization of the social space. There are, rather than just have a few labor unions fighting for, employment rights, we have, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of groups doing the same thing. I think it is a much more democratic, responsive, dynamic system. But I think a thing I was afraid of years ago has come to pass, and that is that it's too easy in the social space to reduce things to bumper stickers and And then when we utter them, we get the same sort of rush that we might get if we actually did something useful. So, activism by tweet, I think fires up the same hormones in our brain as actually helping somebody on the street who's homeless. And I think that, or signing a petition against climate change fires up the same sort of self satisfaction that does doing something of actual value. And so I think there's a real problem in the social space, and I don't know what we do about it. I think most people who believe themselves to be social activists or social innovators are doing things that actually require very little investment, but unfortunately provide the same hormonal boost.
Yeah, what a great and important insight and challenge too to all of us, right? That meaningful action, right, is 100x, right? Like trying to do something, that's mass, like a tweet. You're right.
But do you mind if I go back into that for 1 minute?
Yeah, by all means.
Among the things you didn't say in my introduction, and which is absolutely fine, is that I had a role at a university for a number of years, and in that role, I had occasion to try to define social innovation in a useful way. Social innovation is a fuzzy idea, frankly, but I had been asked to design the first doctorate in social innovation, and so it was incumbent upon me in doing it to nail down the definition in a way that students could grasp and then deliver against. Right? It just I had to do it. I had to define social innovation. So where I landed after several years of work on it was the idea that it isn't social innovation unless it leaves the social norms around the problem changed. So if you if you open a soup kitchen, I think that's great. And God love you, and you're getting into heaven when I'm not. And I think that's awesome. I think we need more people feeding those of us who are hungry. But it's not social innovation. When it becomes social innovation is when the norms around hunger or the way we deal with it are changed so that the problem of hunger goes away. So
I love that. I mean, I love that, and we're going to dive into that a little bit. I have one more question.
Yes, sir.
Looking back, but I definitely want to build on what you just said. This notion that unless we actually change, it's not an innovation if we just think about it, right? It's not an innovation if we write a white paper, right? It's an innovation when on the ground.
Not an innovation if we actually do something great and useful. It is only an innovation if a social innovation. It can be an innovation, right? A commercial innovation, being if the norms around the problem are changed, right? So what Rotary is doing by partnering with the World Health Organization in order to get every child in the world the polio vaccine is remarkable. Do not get me wrong. It is remarkable, and they should win the Nobel Prize. I mean it. It is a remarkable contribution to the world. However, it's not an innovation, right? An innovation would change the world in such a way is that it does not require Rotary to do what Rotary is doing. It does not require the World Health Organization to do what the World Health Organization is doing, because the norms around sick children or preventative care are forever changed. Well, forever is a big word, but are substantively changed.
I love it. It's a wonderful working definition. Just one quick question that builds off of that, because I came at this, I didn't grow up in this space, right? I grew up in the boring corporate, innovation in the context of, large, in that case, companies, right? And it's only when I took on an accidental bureaucrat role here in Rhode Island that all of a sudden I started having the epiphany about what real innovation is in the context of people every day, who live in this space. And my question for you really relates to, aren't people and organizations that are in the quote unquote social space, aren't we part of our own problem here because we've created our own silos? Like, don't we all have responsibility, right, to work to do what you're suggesting? And we're going to talk about how we change those norms through your recent work with the Unwritten Rules. But don't we have to start with who has responsibility to do it? Is there a social sector? Why isn't all innovation social, right? And we start thinking differently about who's in or out of working on those types of challenges.
Okay, let me pull that apart. There are a couple of interesting things you said in there. The first one is, do I think that we should all be working at changing the norms around the problems we're trying to solve? The answer is no. I don't think so. By the way, there's a wonderful piece by a woman named Elizabeth Lynn, who was an academic in Indiana, I think Valparaiso, maybe, I don't remember what university. And she wrote a piece that just doesn't get nearly enough attention. It confounds me. And she talks about the 4 kinds of it's not charity, but we'll use that word because I can't think of the 4 kinds of what, but of essentially helping others. And the first one is give a man a fish, right? And the second one is teach a man to fish. And the third one is empower a man to change the conditions so that he no longer requires you to give him a fish. And the fourth one, as I recall, was empower a man to help change the systems in which people don't have fish, right? I'm sure I'm mischaracterizing it, but that's the general idea. I do not believe that everybody ought to be in the fourth box. I think it would be a bad world if everybody was as esoteric and disconnected from actual human suffering as I am. I think we need more people doing the kind of work that Mark Brand does, that our mutual friend Mark Brand does, where he is actually bringing hungry people in off the streets and feeding them in his restaurants. God love him. We need more people doing that. So I do not believe everybody ought to be doing that. Your second question in there was, isn't all innovation social? And the answer is, I don't think so. I don't think all innovation rises to the level of changing social norms. I think there's plenty of innovation that rises the level of making our lives easier and more convenient. And for that, I think those people deserve a lot of money. And so I subscribe to their services and buy their products and use their services. I think that's great. I think there is a subset of people who ought to be worrying about how to change the norms around the problems we have.
Well, for those of us that at least like to think of ourselves being in that second bucket, you are passionate about and have built some real frameworks and tools to how to go about doing that. And I have to tell you, as I've gotten to know you and you came to our summit last year and you shared your work and got people to roll up their sleeves, and really think about this notion of norms and unwritten rules, I can tell you, I hear a lot of these types of theories of change every day. way, this one has stuck with me, my friend, right? Like, I think it is the clearest, most simple way to think about the barrier to systems change, and giving us a way to not only think about it, but to do something about it in manageable contexts in our daily lives. So let's start, right? Talk to me about unwritten rules. What are they? Let's just set the foundation for what are we talking about here, and then we can unbundle that together a little bit, because I think it's really important for our community.
Well, you're very kind. In every social environment, which is fancy talk for any place where you're dealing with other people, there are a collection of unwritten rules about how you're supposed to behave together, that if you follow them, you will fit in and thrive. They are, I'm, because this is my work, I'm really sensitive to the difference between unwritten rules and social norms. But I won't bore you or anybody else with the distinction. Except you just have to trust me that they are different in some important ways. And one of the ways in which they're important that is germane to this conversation is that social norms take a long time to be established, relatively, and unwritten rules, if you and I and your producer all come together around this podcast, there are unwritten rules about how we deal with each other, even though we will likely never, the three of us, be in this situation again. So they're good for pop-up environments. Social norms don't really work that way. They're sort of longer, deeper phenomena. Okay. So if you think about unwritten rules are in every social environment we're in, we are unintentionally signing up for behaving this way. And we should examine those to see if we can make improvements in an environment. If you're interested, as you are, in the social sector, how do we make improvements of an environment? Well, I think one of the first things we have to do is look at the assumptions about the way we'll behave with each other in that environment. If we start there, we have all these opportunities to make change.
Can we bring that to ground? Let's share an example of what we mean by that. And I love this. The first time I've heard you say this notion of pop-up rules is fascinating, right?
Pop-up environments, right? So, social norms are big, pop-up norms are, grand pianos, and unwritten rules tend to be, electronic keyboards. That it isn't that they're less important. It's not that they don't make a big sound. It is they're just more flexible and portable than social norms, which are sort of big and ponderous.
Well, okay. On one side, the metaphor of pop-up norms, is like music to an innovator's ears, right? We could create the conditions to behave differently as long as we make explicit the things that are unwritten about how we're supposed to do this. And we could agree, just you and I, this is how we're going to do this for this next half hour, on the podcast. But on the other side, the metaphor of pop-up rules suggests that they're ephemeral, right? And they don't last, right? That they're so I love unbundling that notion of
there are a couple of things. Let me put finer points on. You suggested, and we should talk more about this, that it is possible to design unwritten rules. I'm not sure I'm convinced of that, by the way. I think the real value of understanding the concept is recognizing the shackles that you're already wearing and making a decision about what to do about it. I don't know. It is recognizing that I'm 5'8" and therefore should probably not try out for the NBA. It doesn't mean I can create height. It just means I need to recognize the design constraints for what they are. And the the social design, the social constraints, if you will, are something we just don't think about. We're just not prepared to think about.
So give us an example. I noticed you've been, attracting a lot of stories from our broad community, and really taking the topic into everyday contexts and situations. So just pick one to demonstrate what the unwritten rules might be, and then we can talk about what we might do with that knowledge if we wanted to change them or act differently.
So I'm spending a lot of time with the sort of what's called the workplace design and strategy community. It's a series of coincidences that led me there, including a mutual friend of ours, AJ. So I think a lot about how unwritten rules apply in their world and what the relevance is to the jobs that they're trying to do in commercial real estate. And one that I just posted the other day, yesterday or day before, or maybe it comes out next week, I'm not sure, is this idea that, we had this great breakthrough that we have what's now called free address, where anybody can sit anywhere and nobody has assigned seating in an office. And wouldn't this be nice if people could just feel free to move around the office, right? It's this, they believe that it is more in keeping with how people are wired. What if we made every office like WeWork? I think is essentially what they're doing. I don't know the rationale. I don't quite understand the rationale behind it, because there's an unwritten rule that says, actually, if your boss can't find you right away, your boss assumes you're not doing it, right? So this unwritten rule is getting in the way of change we want to make, and will, in fact, because the rule is so powerful, unwritten rules are incredibly powerful, will doom the change. You and I have a mutual friend, Ami, right? And I went and met with her and her colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital, and we were in a conference room, and a few of her colleagues were looking at me skeptically about the unwritten rules in their world and what possible differences it make to us, and that isn't how we operate. We're immune from that. I don't know what they weren't saying that. I think I assume everybody hates the idea. So I said, let's assume that you are going on rounds and you're going to lead, the healthcare team around and talk about the various patients. And they said, yes, we do that every day. And I said, and assume you come to a floor and there you've encountered a patient you've never seen before. And they say, yes, that happens all the time. And I said, and there is a nurse who's been on the floor for 20 years and actually knows this patient. And they said, yes. I said, of course, the nurse, being most familiar with the case and most familiar and having been in healthcare much longer than you, of course, the nurse would lead the rounds. And there was this silence. And they looked at me and they said, well, of course not. We would lead the rounds. And I said, so just so that I understand, somebody who's less familiar with the case, less seniority in the field, would be in charge of the healthcare team and not the person with more seniority and more familiarity with the case. And there's this sort of look of shame, which is not my point. My point is that it never occurred to anybody, at least nobody in that room, that healthcare outcomes were predetermined in part by an unwritten rule about how rounds work.
So so those are two really good examples, Jeff, like really clear. You can understand how these unwritten rules form. They're everywhere, right? Yes. But they're not written down. They're not part of the formal coda, right? They're not in the policy book, right? But yet they're everywhere we turn, in almost every social context we can imagine.
No, in every social context.
Right. So you just talked about two that are pretty interesting and relevant. And so once we have that insight, now what do we do with it, right? What do we do with that insight now that we've recognized it, right? Are we putting in place a new unwritten rule? Talk to me about what we do with the insight.
I'm not a scientist, but it would be asking a scientist halfway through their work how it's going to turn out. The answer is I don't have a perfect answer for you yet. I know that recognition of the constraint is a big deal, right? It's admitting you're an alcoholic is a huge step in confronting your, in resolving your, at least living with your alcoholism. It is the same thing. Recognizing the constraint is a big deal. People like you and me who have been paid as corporate consultants have in our sordid past have a tendency to want to create written policies and guidelines to address the unwritten rule and to get everybody going in a different direction. Unfortunately, those don't work. Period. Will not work. Doesn't resolve the problem. Can you and I engineer a new unwritten rule? That's not clear to me yet. I'm working with several different groups to try to explore if that's possible, and if so, how. And I don't have a good answer for you.
So it's in process. So you're like we've got you at a period where you've gotten to the ability to create these really compelling insights, which are easy once you have the lens. And now you're going to take this into the marketplace and in a generative way, which we designers do, learn how to do it. So tell me how you're taking it to the market. How do people learn about what you're up to who want to be part of this journey? Because everywhere we turn, since you introduced me to this concept, I see unwritten rules everywhere I go. I curse you, by the way, right?
Good. Thank you.
Which you'd expect, no less. But they're everywhere, right? And so now I'm all about, okay, I can see them, I can talk about them with other people. Now, how do we collaborate, right? To even if initially it's just pop-up conditions, right? To say we have the courage that it doesn't have to work that way.
Well, I think we're skipping a step in this conversation, and that is that the only value of diagnosis is treatment. That's essentially what you're saying. Okay, now I've recognized them. Tell me what to do. Tell me what antibiotic to take that will get rid of what I've just discovered. And the answer is, I think as human beings, we're pretty flexible, we're pretty thoughtful, we're pretty imaginative, we're pretty innovative, that recognizing the conditions that we're working within allows us to modify our individual behavior in that environment in order to be more successful in that environment. I'll give you an example. So let's go back to the idea of free address, right? So let's say you and I work in an office in which they say, Saul, Jeff, you can sit anywhere you want. It doesn't make any difference. But we have recognized that after a while, our boss, who's nuts, if they can't find us immediately, they assume that we're playing golf and we're not taking our job seriously. And so what do we do about that? Well, the hack that most people do is sit in the same place every day. That's what the research is showing, is that even though there's free address, people are settling into the same spots. Are they creatures of habit? Maybe, but it is also just as likely as it's because that's how they get supervised, right? So what do you and I do? Well, you and I are pretty creative guys. I think I would set up a daily briefing with my boss, so my boss knew what I was doing in the morning and what I was going to do in the afternoon and where the stuff we talked about yesterday was. And it's not that I would schedule time on his or her calendar. I think I would just pop by the office every day, make it fairly regular, so that it would buy me the opportunity to partake in free address, right? The point is that recognizing the constraint allows me to get creative in solving it. I don't know that I know how at this moment to change the condition for everybody.
I love that, Ed. What a great charge for everybody. This is what I have to keep learning over and over again about. Design teaches us this, right? That you can't analyze your way there. It's not about trying to replace a structured set of rules with another structured set of rules. It's about you're saying it's about the insight, and it'll be generative what we do with it. It'll be specific to you and I, and how we deal with it to create better outcomes. And I think that's really consistent with human-centered design and enabling the emergence of new ways of living and working together that are going to happen at the organic level and happen that way. I like that. Can we kind of conclude with some practical advice for folks? I do want you to make sure to talk about how people can learn more about what you're doing and the learning curve you're on. I think there's a lot of people who are very interested in exploring this. But also, can you leave us with some advice? Start with individual, and then feel free to take it up to kind of organizational or community level. But start with just belly button to belly button. I
think the advice I have for people is to recognize that these are huge influences on each of us and how we behave in every moment that we're around other people. And recognize that while we are strong, thoughtful, independent people, we are actually not. And we are actually sort of following rules of convention about succeeding in a particular environment. When I was with you at your summit, I pointed out that the best thing I've ever read on this topic was written by Frank Zappa, who said that life is like high school with money, and that all of us are in the lunchroom holding a tray, looking for a table that makes sense to us. So my first advice to people is just recognize that in every moment, this is how human creatures behave, that we've behaved this way for somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years. This is really important. And so step one is just recognize they're around you all the time. I think step two is do not fool yourself into believing that they are somehow secondary to written rules. Written rules are a sort of relatively recent invention in human history. They aren't all that influential on our behavior. They are trumped 100% of the time by unwritten rules. So yes, court systems are designed. Court systems are designed to follow them, but we aren't as human animals. And then think about how you might, given this constraint that you've recognized, how might you adapt your behavior to be more successful at an environment now that you know it, right? It is, I know I'm not being too specific. This is a really big and complicated thing I'm in the middle of, so it's a little hard. So let me get to your second question, which is, how can people plug into what I'm doing? There is a website that I put up for this purpose called unwrittenlabs.com. On it are several interesting things. One of which is there's a form there that will allow you to contribute an unwritten rule that you've encountered in your career to our collection. And we're building sort of the first giant collection of unwritten rules in the workplace. This will allow us to study them and understand them better. And I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions. They're just fascinating. And I'm learning all sorts of things, not only about other people's careers, but about my own that I couldn't recognize. People turn out to be much more insightful than I am. On that website are also some things that you may find entertaining. I have interviewed people who have interest, like really weird jobs or participate in hobbies that most of us don't. And I'm interested in the unwritten rules in those worlds. So there are unwritten rules on the International Space Station and unwritten rules at Burning Man and unwritten rules in a recording studio and unwritten rules at a professional poker tournament and all sorts of that. And you can look at those there. Those are fun. And I think will provide real value to us going forward. I just don't know what the value is yet. And there's also on this site links to social media feeds. What I like to say about social media is the following. If you are not on social media, you should not join it. It will take up all of your productive time. It will depress you and it will rot your soul. However, if you're on it, you ought to follow us on your favorite platform. And there on unwrittenlabs.com are links to Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and Twitter. And about once a week, sometimes twice a week if I'm moved, there are kind of brief, less than 20-second videos with a new unwritten rule that somebody has submitted to me that you may find helpful to you once it's been pointed out to you.
Jeff, beautiful. I want to thank you for our friendship, for joining me here in the Business Model Sandbox. I should mention I'm so grateful for our connection through the Hatch Network, our friend Yaro Kraner, and many of the people you mentioned. Now I come from this shared network of learning and human-centered, trying to improve the world. And I learned so much from you and others in Hatch. And now it's so overlapping with the BIF network. Sometimes I can't tell where these folks come from, and I think that's the way it should be. I would walk more. I would run. Never mind walk to the website for Unwritten Rules. Take a look at what Jeff's been working on. Engage in this conversation. I promise you, the power of this notion of being self-aware and knowing the unwritten rules around us gives us an incredible foundation for action. I think your insights were great. Jeff, thanks for visiting the Business Model Sandbox today.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a real pleasure both to get to know you and to have this conversation.